Brendon O'Connor is an associate professor at the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. I asked him about how critical it was for President Obama to enlist all Muslims in the fight against IS.
I think it's very important. I think Obama made quite a complex speech today where he argued that there needs to be a tolerance of all religions, there doesn't need to be scapegoating, but a perverted form of the Muslim religion is associated often with acts of terrorism that we've seen in recent years, and that needs to be addressed sort of head on. That using, as he'd see it, the true way of talking about various religions and what the beliefs of various religions are is a way to counter faulty beliefs and forms of violent extremism, which this conference is about. So I suppose it's a battle of ideas, which he's very confident the United States can win, arguing that the United States has always been good at winning these in the past, in the Cold War and elsewhere. So I think it's a pretty smart and sensible strategy.
How, though, do they win this war? It seems quite a difficult one. Every turn they take, it seems this extremism rises up in another form.
Well, I think Obama's argument is don't be what some of these extremists are suggesting we are as a society, and I think that's where really George W. Bush went wrong. That this is ultimately a small group of fanatics who have, really, really foolish ideas about how they might take over the world, or ideas about how to settle problems through very extreme actions. Now, the vast majority of Muslims, the vast majority of people in the world are totally against that way of solving political problems. And so I think Obama recast the argument to say, look, there's, a humanity that wants a kind of peaceful existence done through democracy or negotiations, and there's a small group of people who believe you solve problems through beheadings or through acts of extremism. So I think to not play into the terrorist's hands has been very important in his administration, not to make arguments that you're either for or against us, or that this is a war like a war against fascism, to use a much more sensible language, which I think Obama was trying very hard to do today.
And the language also changed in terms of just a pure military fight as well.
Yes, I think this is crucial. I mean, this is a big contrast, I think, between the Republicans. We heard Jeb Bush speak today about how the United States needs to talk tough and needs to sort of face any force head on. Now that approach doesn't tend to work, and it tends to be that you have to have a sort of multi-pronged approach, which often has to have political solutions. There has to be power sharing ultimately in Iraq between Sunni and Shia groups, and with the Kurds given some degree of autonomy for things to work, and that's really where things have broken down. And I think ISIS has risen out of that lack of political cooperation, not so much the fact that the US has pulled its troops out or hasn't been tough enough militarily.
You mentioned the Bush name a number of times there. Of course, the legacy from George Bush, both senior and junior. Now, of course, Jeb Bush putting his hand up to potentially run as the Republican candidate, really trying to, again, impose himself as somebody with a tough response to this issue that's facing the United States and the world, indeed.
Well, he's got to differentiate himself from his brother. Ultimately, his brother's presidency was pretty unsuccessful. By the end, George W. Bush's popularity was very low, and I think most people would argue the decision to go to war in Iraq in 2003 was a grave mistake and has had very long-term negative consequences for the United States. So I think he's got to say, well, look, there was no weapons of mass destruction, that was a mistake. But he's making this argument that his brother was brave to believe in the surge in 2007 onwards, that George W. Bush had done something which was unpopular at this point that really turned the war around. I don't think this is entirely the truth. I mean, the surge may have reduced violence, but it didn't create a lasting political solution. It didn't create a lasting solution of power sharing. So I think there tends to be an overplaying of how successful that surge really was as something which would lead to a lasting peace in Iraq.
You think too, if he's trying to establish himself as his own man, he would not necessarily go back for the counsel of up to 22 advisors of both his father and his brother.
Well, I think he comes out of the same part of the Republican Party as those two family members, not surprisingly. He's an establishment figure. He's a little bit like Mitt Romney in some ways. He's saying very similar things to Romney. He's a person who's not at the extremes of the Republican Party, and that will be a bit of a problem for him running. And so to be able to find a whole new group of foreign policy advisors would be very difficult, because that would call upon different factions of the Republican Party, or maybe just much younger people. So I think it's inevitable that he'll go back to the same fundraisers. Some of the same connections will get him ahead in the party, but they'll also raise these questions of, really, is this just more of the past? Is this a man who's, you know, very connected really to his brother, who was in the end, I think, a failed president?
Be interesting to watch it play out. Great to talk to you, Brendon. Thanks.
My pleasure.